Hey everyone, welcome back. In the previous episode, we took a look at how to add the refresh token by configuring the allow offline access scope and requesting that scope for our MVC client and setting up some of the facilities that Identity Model provides us in terms of convenience of refreshing the access token and the refresh token. In this episode, we're going to start taking a look at Implicit Flow. Let me close this and let's basically get one thing straight. Implicit Flow is good for applications where the client lives on the user agent, right? So a user agent is a browser or a mobile device, right? So like a native application or a spa would be living on the user agent, and our MVC client is really living on the server. And the illusion of when you are interacting through the browser, all you're doing is you're basically clicking on HTML. You don't have access to any of the code that we have here. But if you have a spa or a native application, the code is on the user agent, it's on the device, and that means things are compromised. So for Implicit Flow, you're not allowed a refresh token. I'm going to state this straight away. There are other ways that keeping the access token up to date are achieved. So first of all, let's go ahead and create our JavaScript client. First of all, let's go ahead, add a new project, and let's create an ASP.NET Core application, and let's call JavaScript client. Oh, that's not where you enter the name. Right, JavaScript client, create. And again, we will just start with an empty template. Okay, as usual, let's go into startup, and the primary goal for now is to serve a page where our JavaScript client will be. Okay, everything here is looking all right. I will add map default controller route, and in here services, add controllers with views. Okay, so this is pretty much almost good enough to start serving stuff. Let's go ahead and also add, maybe before here, app use static files. Okay, static files, this is just where I want to place my JavaScript. And let's go ahead and create a www root folder for this. So www root. Next thing, we want to create a controller folder and create a home controller as usual. And for this, I will go into my MVC client and I'll actually just go into views, copy this whole views folder, and I'll paste it into here. And I'll delete the secret folder, and I'll double check that I don't have anything in my index folder. Okay, it's just homepage, which is good. Another thing in my home controller, let's just inherit from a controller. And public I action result index serve the page return view. Now, before we dive into JavaScript client and how to set it up, I just want to first of all go into the specification, and we'll just glance over what it says about making basically the flow, right? And we will take a look at the example of how the current client works as well. So authentication request, again, this is something that we do when we redirect our client to the identity server to authenticate, right? And this is what it would look like. So we have an authorized endpoint, response type. So response type, again, if we go to the top, we go into authentication, yep, and we take a look at the response types. Code is for authorization code flow, which is what we used. And then there's ID token and token for implicit flow. So I think I talked about this a little bit, but essentially to refresh your memory, ID token is for authentication. And if we request an ID token response type, we're just going to get the ID token. Token is the access token, and that's for accessing protected resources, so your APIs. To get the access token back from the identity server, you need to basically add the token response type, right? So preferably, we just want both. Okay, so let's go back up and back to the implicit flow part. Okay, so response type is required, redirect URI. So this part is basically, we still have the callback, so we need to travel to identity server and back to our JavaScript application, right? And the nonce is required. And this is just verify that the ID token that you have gotten back is from the correct place. And again, this is just what it would look like. If we would have been dealing with authorizing at this place straight away, which we don't, and what I mean by that is this is not where we log in, right? This is where the authorization happens, right? This is what is starting to deal out the tokens, and that's when it drops you back to your JavaScript, redirects you back to your JavaScript client. What we have is we go to the login screen. So this is going to be our return URL, right? And to shine a bit more light on this, I'm just going to launch the application and we're going to dissect the current return URL that we have. Because first of all, I want to show you how to craft this URL before we start using a library and go in blindly. So let's go to home/secret. We're not going to do any logging in. Let's go ahead and just grab this URL, copy paste this, and I'm going to go into Notepad++ here, and we're just going to take a look at this URL. Okay, so I'm going to paste this in, and I really want to break it down into a couple of parts. The first part here is, maybe can I make this bigger? I can. So the first part here is really where we're navigating in terms of identity server, right? So we're at auth login and we specify a parameter of a return URL, right? So at this point, this is a value, right? So this is a singular value. All malarkey that is going on here, this is just a string and it acts as a value for the return URL. Okay, so let's go ahead and drop this return URL down here, and I will sort of nest the URI encoding and where the values in are basically. So okay, so this is a value, number one. Then we have the return URL set to %2f is essentially a slash, right? So we go to connect, authorize, and then we have callback, and this is where we get %3f, which is a question mark. So this is where the parameters start to flow in. This part here is essentially where our redirect to the authorized endpoint will start. Okay, so let's go ahead and break this down a bit more. Kind of like the parameters start here with the return URL. This is where I'm going to say this is where we have client ID and we have client ID MVC. Then we have the redirect URI. And again, %3d is equals. And this is where we start to get these 4-letter encoders. And this is where basically it's another nest in terms of the value. So once this value gets decoded, it's going to be split up into parameters, and we're gonna have this singular redirect URI. So this is a redirect URI which goes to localhost, signin OIDC, and this is the redirect URI, basically the endpoint to which you get redirected after identity server has hit the authorized endpoint, and this is something that the OpenID Connect middleware gives us. And then we are back at 3-lettered encoders, so this means that we're out of the value. So let's go back here. So essentially, this will be a value for redirect URI, right? So if you're confused by now as to why we're doing this, I want to show you what the middleware sort of does for you, right? It crafts this URL and it redirects you to the client, okay? Or rather, crafts this value. And what I want to do now is, before we start using a library, I want to do the same, and I want to show you how this is done. All right, and we're sort of going to bounce between this example and the spec. Okay, so coming back to this, we now have the response type, which is code. And again, we just went over this. The reason we set the response type to code is because of the flow that we're using, right? And again, we have the scope equals, and again, we are seeing the sort of like quadruple numbers, or essentially this means that the scope values are encoded as well as a value. Okay, so a scope is a string, and if it be comma separated or space separated, this is essentially where it will end. And let's go ahead and drop this down to a new line. So after equals, we'll put a tab here. So this is a single value, and this is a single value. So we'll have to encode the scope, and we'll have to encode the redirect URL before assigning them to these values, and encoding the whole thing afterwards to assign it to the return URL. Next thing, code challenge looks something specific to the code flow. Let's go ahead and just drop this to a new line. So code challenge method. I will ignore this because this seems like something that comes with the code response type. So let's keep going. Response mode from post. Okay, that's nice. Next thing is the nonce value. This is going to be quite big. Okay, and I found the state there. We have the nonce, the state, and the state is quite large as well. So I'm going to start from the end now. Basically looking if there for any nesting, which will result in percentage and followed by 4 characters. And if I don't find anything like that, that means there is no nesting, right? So going through this one by one, I don't see any more percentages here. I see this one, but it's percentage 3D, which is essentially an equals. So at this point, this seems like something that the middleware generates, as I have not seen that in the spec. The state, the nonce was required, if we remember correctly. These two seem like something specific to the code flow. So let's go ahead and just remove the stuff that we don't want. So we don't want this response mode. We'll leave it for now. This client stuff, let's go ahead and delete this client stuff. And we're pretty much left at this, right? So the only two things that we'll have to encode is the scope and the redirect URI, and then the whole thing. Let's go ahead and close this down. Well, I'll minimize this for now, and we'll bring that back up once we are encoding stuff. Let's go ahead into www root folder, and let's create a sign-in.js. And this is where I'm essentially just going to place my sign-in logic and route crafting. And what I'll do is I will bring up my homepage, that way, and I'll take my sign-in and I'll take my sign-in.js. I'll drag it into my index.cs.html. I'll format this a little bit, and all should be good now. Let's go ahead and add this JavaScript client to our startup. So what I want to do is I want to go into properties, manage solution properties, and essentially I want to disable the API and the API too, because that's just going to be too much bulk. I want to disable MVC client. I want to keep the identity server, but I want to turn on JavaScript client, right? So at this point, we're not trying to authenticate with an API, so there's no point of starting them up. So what I want to do is just go to the identity server, authenticate, and get back. Let's go ahead, click OK on this, and let's start this up. Okay, so here we're on the homepage. Let's double check that we are getting our sign-in.js. Let me close this. There is our sign-in.js, so it's empty. Let's go ahead and first, before redirecting, we know that we have to basically make a request, right? And before we make an authorization request, we need to authenticate with an identity server. So essentially, what we have to do is we have to craft this value for the return URL. And once we log in, the return URL is going to send us to the authorization endpoint, where the callback parameter is set to wherever we need to return, right? And if I go into the specification and I would go to the point where it was showing an example of how it looks like right here. So you can see this is sort of like a value. So these ands and the question marks aren't encoded, but the HTTP value and the OpenID and profile values are encoded, right? So let's go into, let me actually put this side by side. Close these diagnostic tools, and we'll go into sign-in.js and close the rest. And first of all, let's make a button. And on click of this button, we want to sign in. And this is where I will do the sign in function. Okay. Let's go ahead and create a var sign in equals function. And all I want to do is just console log a URL where I'm going to go ahead and create this URL. Okay. Let's go ahead and type in hello world just so we know it's working. Let's go ahead and refresh this. Seems my Chrome has broken. It's gonna be dynamic compilation, isn't it? Yeah, we have enabled it before, so let's go ahead and do this for this tutorial as well. Into the client here. Yep, runtime compilation. Let's go into the JavaScript client here. Actually, client CS_proj. We'll grab everything. We'll put it here and we'll remove the Newtonsoft JSON stuff. Next thing is, so we're adding dynamic compilation to JavaScript client. It's just because whenever we change the CS HTML, it's not going to change. So that, I want it to change just so I can go back and forth. Next thing in the startup here, I want to grab this add razor runtime compilation, and I will go into the startup of my JavaScript file, and I'll add this here. Okay, cool. Hopefully this will work now. Okay, so the button is there. Let's go ahead and test it real quick. Hello page, hi. There it goes. Recompiles really slow, but that's okay. So let's go here, and we don't really want this page here. We also want this primarily. The first thing, if I can actually format this, the first thing that we want is the return URL, right? And it will have a value. So let's go ahead and create that. Let's create a return URL, and it is going to be a value that we are going to encode, right? So JavaScript has a function available to you, encode URI, and this is where we can basically take a string and encode it to this, right? So it's a very convenient thing to do, right? Let's go ahead, set it here, and what are we passing? What are we encoding? We are encoding a navigation to the authorization endpoint and all of its parameters, right? So let's go ahead and create an auth URL. Or you can call it authorization URL, but this should suffice. So let's go ahead and delete these. Let's actually do the auth URL first, and let's start with the simple stuff, right? We're gonna do /connect /authorize and /callback. I'm gonna have to like drop these down and down, or maybe I'll use JavaScript magic just for now. So this is the first part where we basically tell it where we want to redirect. The next thing is the client ID, right? So we haven't actually set up the client with IdentityServer. Where is it? Here in the configuration for this, but we will do this in a second. But this doesn't really stop us from basically going right. Client ID equals client ID, and we'll do something similar, but we'll call it JavaScript. Okay, next thing is redirect URI. So this is basically an encoded value, and if you have spotted, similar to encode URI, we have an encode URI component. This is essentially does what it sounds like. It also encodes stuff, but it does so for a component. So this is what we want to use, but we want to use it for a redirect URI. So let's go ahead and create this value, var redirect URI. And we don't really have a redirect URI yet, because this redirect URI should be living on our JavaScript client somewhere, right? So if you have a SPA application, you're going to expose some route where you're going to redirect to, and that will handle your sign-in logic, where you're going to persist stuff to your local storage. So for now, let's go ahead and call it something like sign-in, right? We'll do quite simple. So HTTP, do we have HTTPS? I think we do. We do have HTTPS, so I will call this HTTPS. Let me drop this down. // I'll actually drop this down to a new line, and I have forgotten an encode there. So local host / I'm running out of space, so let me grab this. Let me actually do this. I will set the redirect URI here, smaller, and we'll do something like sign in, right? So this is where we're going to redirect. Sign in, and we want to redirect to the correct port. So this one here, :4 5, And obviously, you would store this somewhere in your environment configuration files, like .env or something like that. Here we have Redirect URI. Let's go ahead and encode URI component. Redirect URI. Hopefully that is sliding off a little bit. So let's go ahead and pop this somewhere here, right at the start. Pop this here. And pop, like this. Okay, I'm happy with that. Right, next, where is it? Response type. Okay, so let's go ahead and see, because the response type is going to be looking a little bit different. Here we can see %20. So this is something similar to a space. We don't see the encoding here because it's just one value. All right, so there is no spaces. Otherwise, if there was another string there, we would see something along the lines of %25, which is encoding for a percentage sign, which will equate to %20, which is space, right? We need to encode this part as well, and this is why it's important to bounce between the two things, so you can get a better understanding. So again, what were we just looking at? We were looking at response type. So let's go ahead and just copy this. We'll pop this here, response type, and this is where we will replace this with response type. Let's go ahead and make this variable. And we will grab these. So remember, ID token and token. This is for your ID token and access token. This is what requests that. We want to replace this with a space, and we want to encode URI, this component, like so. Okay, so next thing is the scope. So again, the scope was encoded. So let's go ahead and see what kind of scope we want. So for now, let's go ahead and just request OpenID scope, which will be for our ID token and hopefully access token. Let's go ahead and request scope for API1 as well. So we'll grab API1 here, just so we have a little bit more. And let's go ahead and put a semicolon here. And again, let's say scope equals percentage encode URI component scope, and there we go. Okay, so response mode. Let's take a look if we have a response mode here. We do not. Okay, so I'm gonna assume I do not need it. So let's go ahead into here and just delete it. And for sanity, what we can do is we can just go up and look at the authentication request for the code flow, and we can take a look at the response mode is an optional here, right? So yeah, it's really something that belongs to the authorization code flow rather than the implicit flow. So let's go back here where we were looking at this. The next thing is really the state and nonce, and these are really the only things that are left here as well. So let's go ahead and fill these out. These are random strings, right? So I want to basically generate some random strings. And the way we do this is, let's go ahead and put this up. So create session, we'll do something like that, and var create nonce. And in the real world, you generate these using some smart algorithm. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to return some nonce value, and if it basically gives me an error like this needs to be longer, then I might do that. So let's say session value, make it a bit longer, and maybe give it a bit of those for the nonce value. I'm not taking any chances. Okay, so let's go ahead and create nonce. These really don't need to be functions. We can, again, as I said, preferably you want functions generating these things. In this case, they're pretty much just static values, right? So create nonce. Sorry, not create nonce. We rather want just nonce. And let's create nonce, call the function here, and let's do the same here. Okay. Session? No, this was state. Why not just call it session? Why is it state? State represents the session, but whatever. Create state, and let's make sure we change the function here. Okay. Right, now we're rolling. So this is a value of this. Now we want to essentially encode URI our auth URL, and let's go ahead and log these two to the console. Let's go into our page here. We'll click sign in. Okay. So we have two values. The first one is our URL here, and this one pretty much looks identical. So let's go ahead and copy this. I think I'm seeing an error, which I did. So I'm going to paste this here. And if we look, so it hasn't actually encoded our return URL. So let's go ahead and use encode URI component here and sort of turn this into a value now as well. So we have the route here and we want to turn it into value. So I guess that was just a mistake from me. I want to use this function throughout. So again, let's just give this a refresh, give it a sign in it again. Okay, this looks a little bit better now. So if we take this and have I closed Notepad++? Okay. Let's take a look at this bottom value. So now we have 2f connect. This is looking all right. And let's find the redirect URI somewhere here. So %2538, %2538. Okay, so this is something for a colon. They look more or less identical in terms of the start, and I'm happy at this point that this is something that we can use to redirect to the identity server and authenticate there. So let's go ahead and set this up. This is the return URI value. What we want to do is we want to do window location and href. We want to set this to be for the identity server part. So we're going to set this to here. And now what we want to do is we want to set the return URI value, or rather first we want to go to login and set the return URI value there. So auth.login, actually we can just copy this part here. Let's do that. Let's put this here. Nice. So bleeding a little bit. Let me put this full screen. Okay, so here's our value, and here is where we want to place our return URL value. Nice. Now let's go ahead and make sure that this, I'm going to close Notepad++ now. I think we don't need it anymore. Let's go ahead and make sure that we can sign in. Okay, and here we are, and we're pretty much at the auth login, return URL, and we have the rest of the login encoded with all of our values there. Nice. So at this point, let's go ahead and stop this because we have to actually configure this client with the identity server. So we'll have to go into our configuration and set this up something similar to this. So let's go ahead and set up a new client. Client ID. We will set it to, can I put it here like this? Yeah. Okay, so client ID. What did we say for client ID? We said client ID JS. So let's go ahead and copy this. And this is actually uncomfortable on such a small screen. So let's go ahead and put this here. Next thing is the redirect URI. So we will have to set these here. Actually, there is no difference here. Let's go ahead, put this here, and we set that this will be sign in. So small errors will be fine. Next thing that we said, response type. Okay, so the way we configure the response type, all that we have to do is basically say that the allowed grant types, we will say grant types, and we just say implicit. Next thing, let's take a look at the scope. So let's just copy these scope values, and we will set OpenID and API1 in the same order that we're requesting them. Doesn't really matter, but it makes things a little bit neater. At this point, we are pretty much requesting this stuff. Another thing that we will need to set is we need to tell identity server explicitly that we're allowing access token to be passed in the browsers, right? So what we have to do is we have to say allow access tokens via browser, and let's set this to true. At this point, I think we are good. Let's go ahead and see if we get any errors. Okay, so at the home page, let's sign in. Again, Bob, password, sign in. Okay, so this error seems strange. Let's go ahead back here, and we'll put a breakpoint in our identity server controller and see what's happening. For the login part, let's put it at the redirect here. I think this is where it's occurring. Let's go back to our client here. Let's sign in. So let's take a look at the return URL. Okay. So the primary issue here are these /r/n, and this is essentially new line characters. Go figure. So this JavaScript syntax has actually backfired on me. Let's go ahead and fix this up. I guess I'll have to do this. Say boom, boom. Let's do something like this. Oh, maybe formatting. Nope, I'm not gonna get any formatting. Not in JavaScript files, huh? Let's put this here, here, here. Oh, and here. Okay. I don't think I actually had to close stuff for this. Could have just refreshed, but this point is good. Okay, so let's go ahead and sign in. And again, we have the breakpoint so we can check for these kind of changes. So if we go to the return URL, okay, now we don't have any escape characters essentially. One thing that we do have is we no longer have the string interpolation, so we just have these strings. Oh my. All right, let's put this here and this here, and we'll remove these silly things here. Like that, like that. Well, you know, these things happen. And create nonce, same thing. And here as well. And this is essentially why you build a library. You don't want to be rebuilding this on yourself every single time. And we'll dive into the library in the next episode. Okay, so let's go ahead and sign in. Again, Bob password. Take a look at the return URL. Okay, this is looking okay. Let's see if we get any more errors. Okay, so we're getting redirected to an error, which is good, which means we have encountered some sort of error. So we're actually getting to the authorization endpoint. Let's go ahead into the identity server part, and I think it will be the redirect URI because I have copied it. Okay, and again, I botched up the parameters because I have set everything to be question marks, which is the start of the new parameters, right? So what I want to do is set these to ands. So let's go ahead and set these to ands. And now it will properly be able to separate these parameters, right? Let's go ahead into the client here. Let's go back a few steps and let's Control F5 to flash the cache, refresh, sign in. Bob, password, sign in. Return URL, cool, let's go. Another error, let's take a look at this again. Okay, here we are. Request validation failed, invalid redirect URI. Okay, the redirect URI, as I mentioned, what I thought the previous error was, is essentially because I just realized that I just copied the URI from here, and I haven't set it here, so let's go ahead, go into the JavaScript client here. Oh, not like that, with Alt Enter, into debug, copy this URL, set it here. Nice. Let's try again. Okay. Sign in, Bob, password. Cool. Return URL. Again, I'm gonna remove this breakpoint. Okay, so we hit the consent screen again. So again, this is something that we'll have to disable, and we have disabled it by requiring consent false. So we're gonna do the same thing. Again, remember that we don't get refresh tokens with implicit flow, so we can't allow offline access. Okay, so let's sign in. Bob, password, sign in. Good. So now we have reached our sign-in page. We're back on the client, and the response has the ID token. And maybe somewhere here, yep, we can see the access token as well. And we should be able to see some other stuff like token type bearer, expires in, scope. We have the state, so session value, make it a big long blah, 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 and session state, which will be maintained on our identity server. Now, what happens at this point is when we're at the sign-in page, you would do something along the lines of extracting stuff from the URL, right? So let's go ahead, grab this URL, and we are just going to close everything. We are going to go into the sign-in page here. We're going to paste the URL here for now to sort of hold it. Next thing, let's go ahead and create a new file. And this will be sign in callback.js. Okay, and in here, this is where we'll place the URL for now, because we essentially want to test it. So var callback URL equals blah. So it's a big URL. What we want to do is we want to create a function that will dissect this URL. So once we're back at our JavaScript client, we want to grab the values from the URL, and then we want to redirect back to somewhere sensible. So let's go ahead and create a signin.cshtml page, and I have just realized this would be an invalid URL. So let's go into sign in here, and let's call the redirect URI home/signin, and we will have to change it in the configuration as well. So home/signin. Let's close that. Let's close this sign in as well. In here, again, I will just do something similar. I'll just grab these buttons here and extract tokens. This is what I want to do. Extract tokens. Let's create this function. Okay, auth controller, I'll close that. App settings, I'll close that. Get lost. And then extract tokens, I actually want to grab the correct JavaScript file. Let's go ahead and start this up. Okay, let's go to /home/signin. And I am missing like every single step here. Let's go into home controller and create a public action result, sign in, return view, like that. Okay, let's go to home/signin. Okay, and here we have the function with which we can play. So let's go ahead into the console here, and first of all, in here, let's console log what we want to do, and So let's start with the important parts. We have the hash here, which pretty much indicates where this is going to start, and then we have the parameters. All right, so we can inspect this string a little bit more, and essentially, yeah, it's going to start at hash, and it's going to be then split by and signs, right? And from there on, it's a key value pair. So let's go ahead and do something simple. So first of all, hash, we want to get the value that we basically get back from identity server, right? So return value, we're going to go ahead, grab the callback URI, we're going to split, and we're going to split by a hash, and we are going to grab the second value, right? So the first value is going to be the URL, and the second value is going to be this a good value that we can use. So let's go ahead and put this here. Let's bring up our browser. Oh, refresh this, and here we go. So we have, at this point, we have the part with the stuff that we want to use. Next thing is we want to grab every single variable. So we can go ahead and say var variables, or values even. Let's call them values. Let's grab the return value. Let's again split these with an and, or rather an and like this. And let's grab these here, or rather put them there. Let's refresh. I'll clear my console, extract values. Okay, and at this point I have an array, which again is just ID token, access token, token type bearer, expires in, scope, state, session ID, etc. What I want to do now is grab every single value, and I want to persist it in local storage. And that's if I am going to load up my JavaScript application again. I grab the values from there, and my authentication and authorization essentially persists that way. But it's also because when we go to authenticate with any server, we come back to our application, to the callback URI, we store stuff in the local storage, because at that point we don't want to spin up our application straight away. And then we redirect to our application, and our application is able to retrieve this information. Okay, so how do we do this? We want to make a for loop, or maybe a for each, or a map. Now, there's numerous ways to approach this, but let's go ahead and do a for loop, something super basic. So var index equals 0, I is less than values dot length, and then we want to do I plus plus. Alright, so let's just grab the value from values. We'll grab E, right? So this is going to be the first value, KV. So KV pair, I guess I can call it. So this is a key value pair. This is because I'm going to split it by equals. So I'll just do V split equals. First parameter will be the key, second parameter will be the value. So now when I go to local storage, I will basically do set item KV pair 0, and then KV pair 1. Okay, grab an individual value, split it by the equals. So the first thing in the array will be the key, which is the access token. So again, if we go back into here, ID token, access token. I mean, if you're trying to learn identity server, you probably already know how this works, so I'm not going to ramble on about that. Let's give this a refresh, and let's rather go to local storage here, and let's extract tokens, and baboshka, there we go. So we have our ID token, access token here. If you want, you can prefix this with other values to make these a little bit more unique. So like raw coding.id token. So then if you get an ID token from Facebook or something like that, it's not going to override it with it's going to be like facebook.id, right? So it's not accidentally overridden. This is in essence what the library that we're going to use in the future is going to do. So to basically round this up, and what we want to do, we want to execute this function when we redirect back to sign in, right? So I'm just going to call this function here, and this callback URI, this is no longer going to be here. And the thing that we want to pass here is essentially just window location and href, right? So this is going to be the full address. It's just going to split it here. So what we want to do is we want to pass this address here, and let's replace the callback URL with address, just like that. And by the end of when we store this stuff, we want to redirect back to like home. So let's do location dot href slash home slash index, right? So we're going to end up where we started essentially. So let's go ahead and try this out. First of all, for the home page, I'm going to make sure that I don't have anything in my local storage anymore. Session storage. Nope, it's empty. Okay, let's go ahead and see this. Let's sign in. Let's do Bob, password, sign in. Okay, and we're back at the home page. If we take a look at the local storage, all our stuff is here. And this is essentially a shorthand of what is going to be happening. Okay, these libraries, they do a lot more than this, but in essence, for a rough homemade implementation, this will have to do for the explanation of what's happening. Remember, we are just crafting a URL to redirect to the identity server. We authenticate there, so all the secure stuff is happening on the identity server. And then we get back to a page where we can store the values that we have retrieved and go back to our application. And that is essentially it. Now, this will be it for this episode. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, leave a like, subscribe. If you have any questions, make sure to leave a comment. Join the Discord server. I tend to be pretty active there. And as always, see you in my other videos.